There's a single point on Earth where two oceans physically collide. Not blend, not merge quietly, but visibly clash, their currents fighting for dominance in full view of anyone standing on the cliffs above. Sailors feared this place for 300 years. They called it the Cape of Storms before anyone dare call it anything else. But that collision is only the beginning of the story. Because 600 miles inland, buried under solid rock, sits the largest deposit of a single precious metal ever discovered in human history. So vast that this one country has, at various points, produced nearly half of all the gold ever mined on the planet. And yet, despite oceans of wealth both literal and geological, this is also a nation where, for nearly half a century, the color of a person's skin determined which beach they could walk on, which school they could attend, even which bench they were allowed to sit on in a public park. How does a country hold both of these truths at once? How does a place with this much natural fortune also carry this much human pain, and somehow, against every reasonable prediction, come out the other side still standing, still singing, still dancing in its streets? This is the story of South Africa, and it does not begin with apartheid, or gold, or Nelson Mandela. It begins millions of years earlier, with a piece of land so geologically strange that scientists still argue about why it turned out the way it did. Let's set the scene properly. South Africa sits at the very southern edge of the African continent, wrapped by two oceans, the cold, nutrient-rich Atlantic to the west and the warm, tropical Indian Ocean to the east. It shares borders with Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Eswatini, and, in one of the more unusual geographic quirks on Earth, it completely surrounds another sovereign nation, the tiny mountain kingdom of Lesotho, like a country swallowed whole. That alone makes South Africa one of the only nations in the world to fully enclose another independent state within its borders. But the geography gets stranger the deeper you look. Most countries have one dominant climate. South Africa has almost all of them. Along the western coast, the Namib's dry influence creates a desert landscape, so arid that some regions haven't seen meaningful rainfall in years. Head east, and the climate transforms into lush, subtropical greenery, home to some of the richest biodiversity on the continent. Travel inland, and you hit the high, dry plateau of the Highveld, where Johannesburg sits over 5,500 feet above sea level, higher than Denver, the so-called mile-high city. This geographic diversity isn't just a curiosity for travelers. It shaped everything about how this nation developed. The interior plateau, called the Highveld, offered fertile ground for agriculture and grazing, drawing early farming communities inland for thousands of years. The coastline offered ports, trade routes, and eventually became the gateway through which European colonizers would arrive and never fully leave. Then there's the mountain spine running along the eastern edge, the Drakensberg Range, meaning Dragon Mountains in Afrikaans, a jagged wall of basalt cliffs that rises over 11,000 feet and forms a natural border with Lesotho. Sand hunter-gatherers left behind thousands of rock paintings in these mountains, some estimated to be over 2,000 years old, depicting eland antelope, ritual dances, and spiritual visions that still puzzle archaeologists today. And beneath all of it, quite literally beneath it, lies the resource that would eventually reshape the entire nation's destiny. South Africa's geology includes some of the oldest rock formations on the planet, some dating back over 3 billion years. Within those ancient layers sits an almost unfair concentration of mineral wealth: gold, platinum, diamonds, chromium, manganese. This country holds close to 80% of the entire world's known platinum reserves, and for over a century was the single largest gold producer on Earth. Even the rivers here tell an unusual story. The Orange River, the longest in the country, stretches over 1,000 miles from the Drakensberg all the way to the Atlantic, yet unlike the great rivers of other continents, it never supported a major inland trading civilization the way the Nile or the Mississippi did. The terrain simply wasn't built for it. The Vaal River, a tributary of the Orange, instead became an industrial lifeline, its water diverted for generations to keep the mines and factories of Gauteng province running. Geography, in South Africa, was never just background scenery. It was destiny. The minerals buried underground would draw ships across oceans, ignite wars, build cities from nothing, and eventually collide with questions of who gets to profit from a nation's own soil. questions that are still being asked today. To understand how that collision happened, we need to go back. Long before gold mines, long before European sails appeared on the horizon, long before any of the borders we see today existed at all. Human history in this region stretches back further than almost anywhere else on Earth. Fossil evidence found in caves near present-day Johannesburg, a site so significant it's been nicknamed the cradle of humankind, suggests that some of our earliest hominid ancestors walked this exact ground more than 2 million years ago. In 2008, researchers working in these same caves discovered the remains of a previously unknown hominid species, Australopithecus sediba. A find so well preserved it reshaped parts of the scientific understanding of human evolution almost overnight. By the time organized societies began to form, the San and Khoikhoi peoples had lived across the region for thousands of years as hunter-gatherers and pastoralists, developing intricate knowledge of the land, its seasons, and its animals. Later, beginning around 300 CE, Bantu-speaking farming communities migrated south from Central Africa, bringing with them ironworking, cattle herding, and settled agriculture. Over the following centuries, powerful kingdoms rose from these communities: the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Sotho, the Tswana, each developing distinct languages, governance systems, and military structures. By the 11th century, the kingdom of Mapungubwe, near the modern border with Zimbabwe, had grown into a sophisticated trading center, exchanging gold and ivory with merchants as far away as China and India, evidence of which still surfaces today in the form of imported glass beads and porcelain fragments buried at the site. Then, in 1652, something arrived on the southern coastline that would permanently alter the trajectory of the region. The Dutch East India Company established a small refreshment station at the Cape, not intended as a colony, but simply a stopover point for ships traveling the brutal 6-month journey between Europe and Asia. Fresh water, vegetables, and meat for scurvy-ridden sailors. That was the entire original purpose. But refreshment stations have a habit of becoming something else entirely. Within decades, Dutch settlers, who would come to be called Boers, meaning farmers, began pushing further inland, claiming land that was already inhabited by Khoikhoi herders. Conflict followed almost immediately. Disease, introduced by European arrivals, devastated Khoikhoi populations who had no immunity to smallpox and other foreign illnesses. What began as a supply station evolved, generation by generation, into a settler colony with its own language, Afrikaans, born from a blend of Dutch, indigenous languages, and the languages of enslaved people brought from Southeast Asia and Madagascar. The British arrived next, seizing the Cape Colony in 1795, driven largely by its strategic value for controlling shipping routes to India. This set off nearly a century of tension between British colonial administrators and the Boer settlers, who deeply resented British rule and its abolition of slavery in 1834, a policy the Boers saw as a direct threat to their agricultural economy. The response was extraordinary in scale. Tens of thousands of Boer families packed their belongings into ox wagons and began what's now remembered as the Great Trek, a mass migration deep into the interior to escape British authority and establish independent republics beyond colonial reach. But the interior was not empty land waiting to be claimed. It was home to powerful, organized African kingdoms, most notably the Zulu Kingdom, which under the military leadership of Shaka Zulu had built one of the most formidable fighting forces on the continent, pioneering tight battle formations and a short stabbing spear known as the Ecological, a weapon so effective it changed the nature of warfare across the entire region. The Great Trek triggered brutal conflicts, including the infamous Battle of Blood River in 1838, where a vastly outnumbered group of Boer settlers defeated a Zulu army, a battle still commemorated and still deeply contested in South African memory today. Then, in 1867, everything changed again. A young boy playing along the banks of the Orange River picked up a strange, shiny stone. It turned out to be a 21-carat diamond. Word spread across the globe within months. Within a decade, tens of thousands of prospectors flooded into the region, transforming a quiet farming town into Kimberley, home to the largest hand-dug hole on Earth. The Big Hole, excavated so extensively by hand that it eventually swallowed an entire hillside. Just when the diamond rush began settling into a new economic order, an even larger discovery emerged in 1886, the Witwatersrand Gold Reef, the richest gold deposit ever found on the planet. Overnight, a dusty patch of high-felt grassland became Johannesburg, a city that didn't evolve slowly over centuries like most great cities, but exploded into existence within a single generation, built entirely on the ambition of miners, financiers, and fortune seekers from every corner of the globe. This sudden wealth destabilized the fragile balance of power in the region. British imperial interests, hungry for control over the gold fields, clashed directly with the Boer republics who now sat on unimaginable mineral riches. The result was the brutal Anglo-Boer War at the turn of the 20th century, a conflict marked by scorched earth tactics and the deeply painful introduction of concentration camps, where tens of thousands of Boer women and children, along with black African laborers, died from disease and starvation in British-run camps. The British won the war, but the peace that followed set the stage for something far darker. In 1910, the Union of South Africa was formed, bringing British and Boer territories together under one government. But that government was built exclusively by and for the white minority. Black South Africans, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population, had no vote, no political voice, and increasingly, no legal right to own land in their own country. The 1913 Natives Land Act formalized this theft in law, restricting black land ownership to just 7% of the country's total territory, despite black South Africans making up over 3/4 of the population, a mathematical injustice that would define the economic landscape for the rest of the century. By 1948, this exclusion crystallized into formal, codified law, apartheid, a system of racial classification and separation so comprehensive it dictated where a person could live, whom they could marry, which jobs they could hold, which schools their children could attend, and which hospitals would treat them. Every black South African over the age of 16 was required to carry a passbook at all times, a document controlling their movement so tightly that being caught without it in the wrong area could mean immediate arrest. Black South Africans were stripped of citizenship in their own nation and confined to designated homelands, often on the country's poorest agricultural land, while white minority rule controlled the cities, the mines, and the wealth those mines produced.
He was the one
For
who
over
gave
4
the
decades,
orders.
resistance simmered and erupted in waves. The
happen.
1960 Sharpeville Massacre,
It breaks my
where
heart
police
every
opened
time
fire
I
on
think
peaceful
about it.
protesters, killing dozens. The 1976 Soweto Uprising, where school children protesting the forced use of Afrikaans in education were met with lethal police violence, an event that shocked the world and galvanized international condemnation. The image of a dying 13-year-old boy, Hector Peterson, being carried through the streets of Soweto became one of the defining photographs of the entire 20th century, printed in newspapers around the world within days. At the center of the resistance stood a lawyer turned revolutionary named Nelson Mandela, sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964 for his role in the anti-apartheid movement. He would spend 27 years behind bars, 18 of them on Robben Island, a windswept prison rock visible from Cape Town's own coastline, close enough to see the city lights, impossibly far from freedom. On the island, he and other political prisoners were forced into hard labor in a limestone quarry, worked so harsh on the eyes from the glare of white rock that Mandela suffered permanent damage to his tear ducts, unable to cry actual tears for the rest of his life. International pressure mounted through the 1980s. Economic sanctions, sporting boycotts, global divestment campaigns, squeezing the apartheid government from every direction. And then, in February 1990, something almost nobody believed would happen in their lifetime actually happened. Nelson Mandela walked out of prison a free man. 4 years of tense negotiation followed, teetering constantly on the edge of civil war. But in 1994, South Africa held its first fully democratic election, open to all citizens regardless of race. Millions of black South Africans, many of them elderly, stood in lines that stretched for miles, waiting hours under the sun to cast a vote for the very first time in their lives. Nelson Mandela became president, in a nation that many believed was destined to collapse in a violent retribution, instead attempted something almost unprecedented. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission, designed not for punishment, but for public confession, accountability, and, however imperfectly, healing. South Africa didn't erase its wounds. It chose, instead, to speak them out loud. Perhaps nowhere else on Earth is cultural diversity as officially deliberately embedded into a nation's identity, as it is in South Africa. This is one of the only countries in the world with 11 official languages: Zulu, Xhosa, Afrikaans, English, Sotho, Tswana, Venda, and more. A reflection not of bureaucratic indecision, but of genuine, layered complexity. Walk through a single Johannesburg neighborhood, and you might hear 5 different languages spoken within a single city block. This linguistic diversity earned South Africa its enduring nickname, the Rainbow Nation, a phrase popularized by Archbishop Desmond Tutu to describe a country made whole not despite its differences, but because of them. Religion here is similarly layered. Christianity, introduced through colonization, remains the majority faith, but it blends constantly with indigenous spiritual traditions. Ancestor veneration, traditional healers known as sangomas, and community rituals that predate European arrival by centuries.
This is our game.
Islam
right here,
has deep
right
roots too,
Let's go.
particularly in Cape Town, brought by enslaved people
Let's go, team!
transported from present-day Indonesia and Malaysia during the Dutch colonial period. A community whose distinctive Cape Malay culture, cuisine, and architecture remain vividly present in the city's Bo Cap neighborhood, famous for its rows of brightly painted houses. Music is where this cultural layering becomes most alive. South African music helped soundtrack the anti-apartheid struggle itself. Artists like Miriam Makeba and Hugh Masekela carried the sound and message of resistance onto international stages while banned from performing at home. Isaacathemia, a soft, harmonized vocal style born in mining hostels where workers weren't allowed to sing loudly for fear of waking guards, eventually reached global audiences through groups like Ladysmith Black Mambazo. Today, genres like Amapiano, a house-inspired sound born in the townships around Pretoria and Johannesburg, dominate playlists not just across Africa, but increasingly around the world. Sport carries an almost unmatched emotional weight in South African identity. When the country hosted and won the Rugby World Cup in 1995, just 1 year after democracy, Mandela walked onto the field wearing the jersey of the national team, a team whose green and gold colors had, for decades, symbolized white Afrikaner nationalism to most black South Africans. The image of Mandela in that jersey, handing the trophy to the team's white captain, became one of the most powerful acts of reconciliation ever staged on a sports field, later dramatized and filmed for exactly that reason. Nearly 3 decades later, in 2023, the national rugby team won the World Cup for a record 4th time, with a team more racially representative of the country than ever before, captained by a black player for the first time in the tournament's history. Literature, too, has carried global weight. South African writers have won the Nobel Prize in Literature twice. Nadine Gordimer and J.M. Coetzee, both known for fiction that confronted the moral weight of apartheid and its aftermath directly, refusing to look away from uncomfortable truths even when it was dangerous to write them. Food tells its own version of this layered history. Braai, an open-flame barbecue tradition, sits at the center of South African social life across every community and background, so central to national identity that National Braai Day is celebrated annually. Bunny chow, a hollowed loaf of bread filled with curry, emerged from Durban's Indian community, brought by indentured laborers who arrived to work sugar plantations in the 19th century. Bobo tie, a spiced minced meat dish topped with an egg custard, traces its roots to Cape Malay cooking. And boerewors, a spice sausage, remains a Sunday staple across Afrikaner households. Daily life still carries the visible fingerprints of this complicated history. Townships, communities like Soweto, originally created under apartheid to house black workers segregated from city centers, remain home to millions today, now filled with a vibrant, self-sustaining culture of small businesses, music, and community pride, even as inequality between townships and wealthier suburbs remains stark and, for many, painfully unresolved. What ties all of this together isn't a single unifying culture. It's the willingness to hold multiple identities simultaneously. To be Zulu and South African. To be Afrikaner and South African. To be Cape Malay and South African. It's a country still actively negotiating what its shared identity even means, which is precisely what makes it feel so alive. South Africa carries a title few nations can claim. The most industrialized economy on the African continent, and historically, one of the most sophisticated financial systems in the entire Southern Hemisphere. The foundation was quite literally built underground. Mining remains a defining pillar of the economy. South Africa holds the world's largest platinum reserves by a wide margin, alongside massive deposits of chromium, manganese, and gold. At its peak in the 20th century, this country produced roughly a third of the entire world's gold supply from Witwatersrand mines that, in places, plunge more than 2.5 miles beneath the surface, among the deepest mines on the planet, where temperatures rise so intensely that industrial cooling systems are required just to keep miners alive. But an economy cannot survive on rock alone. Agriculture plays a critical role too, particularly in the Western Cape, where centuries-old vineyards produce wine now recognized globally, especially from regions like Stellenbosch and Franschhoek. Citrus, maize, and sugarcane round out major agricultural exports, supported by a climate diverse enough to grow almost anything somewhere within the country's borders. South Africa is, in fact, one of the world's top 10 exporters of citrus fruit, with oranges grown in the Eastern Cape, making their way on breakfast tables in Europe and the Middle East within weeks of harvest. Tourism has grown into one of the most powerful economic engines in recent decades. Visitors arrive for African safaris, world-class wine regions, dramatic coastlines, and a national history so significant that Robben Island alone draws hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, eager to stand in the very cell where Mandela spent nearly 2 decades of his life. Manufacturing also plays a substantial role, particularly in automotive production. South Africa manufactures and exports vehicles for major global brands, taking advantage of a strategic port position connecting Atlantic and Indian Ocean shipping lanes. Financial services, centered largely in Johannesburg, make the Johannesburg Stock Exchange the largest and most liquid exchange on the entire African continent. Yet beneath these genuine strengths sit serious, persistent challenges. Unemployment remains alarmingly high, among the highest of any major economy in the world, disproportionately affecting young people and communities still recovering from the economic exclusions of apartheid. Electricity supply has become a recurring national crisis, with rolling blackouts, known locally as load shedding, disrupting businesses, hospitals, and daily household life for years at a stretch, largely due to aging infrastructure at the state power utility. Inequality remains perhaps the most stubborn challenge of all. South Africa consistently ranks among the most economically unequal nations on Earth, a direct and lingering consequence of decades of engineered segregation, where wealth, land ownership, and opportunity were deliberately concentrated within one racial group for generations. And yet, opportunity persists in surprising places. A growing technology sector, particularly in fintech and renewable energy investment, is drawing global attention. Cape Town has increasingly positioned itself as a tech and startup hub for the continent. While South Africa's renewable energy potential, abundant sun, strong coastal wind corridors, offers a plausible pathway towards solving its own energy crisis using the very geography that has always defined it. Every great nation has cities that tell its story better than any textbook, and South Africa's cities do exactly that. Each one a completely different chapter of the same complicated book. Cape Town, tucked beneath the flat-topped silhouette of Table Mountain, is arguably one of the most dramatically located cities on Earth, where mountain, ocean, and vineyards sit within a 30-minute drive of one another. Tourists flock to the colorful streets of Beau Cap, the penguins waddling along the beaches of Boulders Bay, and the ferry crossing out to Robben Island. But just beyond the postcard views sit sprawling townships like Khayelitsha, home to over 1 million people, a stark visual reminder that Cape Town's beauty and its inequality exist within the very same frame. Johannesburg, by contrast, is a city built entirely on ambition rather than natural beauty. There's no ocean, no dramatic mountain range, just gold buried underground that summoned an entire metropolis into existence within a single generation. Today it stands as the economic heartbeat of the entire continent, home to the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, the historic Soweto township where much of the anti-apartheid resistance was organized, and the Apartheid Museum, widely regarded as one of the most powerful and unflinching historical museums in the world. Durban, along the warm Indian Ocean coastline, carries a distinctly different rhythm, heavily influenced by its large Indian community, the largest outside of India itself, giving the city its famous bunny chow, vibrant spice markets, and some of the country's best surfing beaches. Then there's Pretoria, the administrative capital, known for its jacaranda-lined streets that turn the entire city purple every spring, and Bloemfontein, and Kimberley with its enormous, still visible diamond crater. Beyond the major cities, hidden gems reward those willing to look further. The surreal, otherworldly landscapes of the Cederberg Mountains, dotted with ancient sand rock art. The whale-watching town of Hermanus, where southern right whales come close enough to shore to watch from cafe tables. And the Garden Route, a coastal stretch so consistently scenic that entire road trip itineraries are built around driving it slowly, over several unhurried days. If there's one image most people associate with South Africa before anything else, it's this. An open safari vehicle at dawn, mist rising off the grass, and somewhere out there, the unmistakable shape of a lion moving through golden light. Kruger National Park anchors this reputation. Nearly 2 million hectares of protected wilderness, one of the largest game reserves in Africa, home to the legendary Big Five: lion, leopard, elephant, rhino, and buffalo. But Kruger is only the most famous piece of a much larger conservation puzzle. South Africa's parks and reserves protect an extraordinary range of ecosystems, from savanna grassland to temperate forest to succulent-covered semi-desert. In the arid northern Cape, the Kalahari Transfrontier Park is home to black-maned Kalahari lions and some of the darkest night skies left on the continent, so free of light pollution that the Milky Way is visible with the naked eye on a clear evening. The Cape Floristic region, covering the southwestern tip of the country, deserves special mention. It's one of only 6 floral kingdoms recognized on Earth, and remarkably, the smallest and most biodiverse of them all. Within this relatively compact region grows over 9,000 plant species, more than 2/3 of which exist nowhere else on the planet. The fynbos vegetation that dominates this landscape, hardy, fire-adapted shrubland, is so botanically unique that it was granted UNESCO World Heritage status. Marine life adds another dimension entirely. Along the southern coast, southern right whales migrate every year to calve in sheltered bays, coming close enough to shore that whale watching here ranks among the best in the world without even needing a boat. Great white sharks patrol certain coastal waters in numbers significant enough that shark cage diving has become a notable, if adrenaline-heavy, tourism draw. Every winter, an event unique to this coastline unfolds beneath the waves entirely out of sight. The Sardine Run, when millions upon millions of sardines migrate along the eastern coast in a shoal so massive it can be seen from space, drawing dolphins, sharks, whales, and seabirds in one of the largest predator feeding events found anywhere in the ocean. Conservation here carries real weight and real urgency. Rhino poaching, driven by black market demand for rhino horn in parts of Asia, has pushed South Africa's rhino populations into a genuine crisis over the past 2 decades, prompting intensive and expensive anti-poaching operations involving rangers, drones, and even trained detection dogs. Yet South Africa also remains home to the largest rhino population left on Earth.
Wow, look at the size
meaning the
of
outcome
that.
of this fight matters not
Incredible.
just nationally,
Did you
but for the survival of the species itself. Few places on the planet compress this much ecological richness and this much ecological risk into a single national story. South Africa has 3 official capital cities, not one. Pretoria handles administrative functions, Cape Town hosts the legislature, and Bloemfontein serves as the judicial capital, a division dating back to compromises made during the country's 1910 unification. It's home to the world's largest hand-dug excavation, the Kimberley Big Hole, dug entirely with picks, shovels, and sheer determination before modern mining equipment existed. Table Mountain is estimated to be roughly 6 times older than the Himalayas, making it one of the oldest mountains on the planet, formed hundreds of millions of years before dinosaurs ever existed. South Africa was the first African country to develop nuclear weapons, and remains the only nation in the world to have voluntarily built, then completely dismantled, its entire nuclear arsenal, doing so in the early 1990s ahead of the transition to democratic rule. The cradle of humankind, located just outside Johannesburg, has produced some of the most significant hominid fossil discoveries on Earth, offering evidence that this specific region may have played a central role in the very origins of the human species. South Africa is one of very few countries where you can ski in the mountains and surf in the ocean on the same day, thanks to its dramatic range of climates and terrain within relatively short distances. The 2010 FIFA World Cup, hosted here, was the first ever held on the African continent, and the deep, buzzing sound of vuvuzela horns that filled every stadium became, for better or worse, one of the most recognizable sonic exports in modern sports history. South Africa's constitution, adopted in 1996, was among the first in the world to explicitly protect against discrimination based on sexual orientation, a progressive milestone that stood in striking contrast to the exclusionary laws the country had enforced only years earlier. For all its progress, South Africa remains a country still actively wrestling with the aftershocks of its own history. Unemployment, particularly among young people, remains stubbornly and painfully high, with millions of capable, educated South Africans unable to find stable work in an economy that hasn't yet generated enough opportunity to match its population growth. The energy crisis continues to cast a long shadow. Rolling blackouts have become such a routine part of daily life that businesses now factor scheduled power outages directly into their operating hours, while the state power utility works slowly toward modernizing infrastructure that in some cases dates back generations. Political tension persists as well. The African National Congress, the party that led the fight against apartheid and has governed since 1994, has faced serious accusations of corruption and mismanagement in recent years, leading to declining public trust and a notably more fragmented, competitive political landscape than the country has seen in decades. Land reform remains one of the most emotionally charged, unresolved issues in the country. Decades after apartheid ended, land ownership patterns still largely reflect the racial divisions of that era, and the question of how to fairly and effectively redistribute land remains a genuinely difficult, still unsettled national conversation. Healthcare and education systems show a similarly stark divide. Well-resourced private facilities exist alongside chronically under-resourced public ones, meaning quality of care and quality of education still often depend heavily on where a person happens to be born and into what. Crime, particularly in certain urban areas, remains a serious concern for both residents and visitors, closely tied to the broader challenges of unemployment and inequality that continue to strain communities across the country. None of these challenges are simple, and none have easy solutions. But naming them honestly is part of what makes South Africa's story credible rather than sanitized. Despite everything working against it, there's a case to be made that South Africa's next chapter could look meaningfully different from its last. Renewable energy investment is accelerating rapidly, driven partly by necessity and partly by genuine natural advantage. Vast, consistent sunlight across the interior and strong, reliable wind corridors along the coast make South Africa one of the best-positioned nations on the continent for a serious renewable energy transition, potentially solving its energy crisis and its carbon footprint simultaneously. A young, increasingly tech-savvy population is fueling growth in software, fintech, and digital services, with Cape Town in particular emerging as a genuine innovation hub, drawing comparisons, however early stage, to other global tech ecosystems. South Africa's position within international trade networks continues to matter as well, holding the distinction of being the only African member of the G20 and playing an increasingly prominent diplomatic role advocating for African economic interests on the global stage. Tourism, too, holds significant untapped potential, particularly as South Africa continues investing in infrastructure connecting its safari regions, wine country, and coastal cities into more seamless travel experiences for the growing global demand for authentic, meaningful travel rather than simple sightseeing. None of this guarantees an easy future, but it does suggest a country with genuine tools, natural, human, and geopolitical, to shape one, if it can navigate its internal challenges with the same resolve that carried it through the transition of 1994. South Africa is not a country that fits neatly into a single narrative, and maybe that's exactly the point. It is a nation built from collision, of oceans, of cultures, of histories that were never meant to coexist peacefully, and yet somehow, imperfectly, learned to. It held some of the richest mineral wealth on Earth while also enforcing some of the deepest human inequality of the modern era. It produced both the architects of apartheid and the man who spent 27 years in prison only to emerge and
This
choose
shift from agrarian
reconciliation
to
over
industrial
revenge.
economies
It
wasn't
is a
just
place
about
where
machines.
township
It was a
music
profound
now
social
travels the globe,
reorganization that
where
defined the next
ancient rock
century.
paintings share the same soil as some of the deepest gold mines on the planet, where 11 languages somehow coexist under one flag. The story of South Africa isn't finished. It's still being written in real time by the same population that once stood in mile-long lines simply for the right to vote. There will be more chapters of struggle ahead, and almost certainly more chapters of surprising resilience too. Because if this nation's history has proven anything, it's that it has an extraordinary, almost defiant capacity to keep moving forward, even when everything about its past suggests it shouldn't be able to. If this journey through South Africa's history, culture, and landscapes captivated you, make sure to subscribe. We're exploring one country at a time, uncovering the stories most travel shows never tell. Drop a comment below. Which country should we uncover next? And if you learned something new today, hit like and share this with someone who'd appreciate it too.